Now, there's a stereotype of students living on baked beans and pot noodles, but the abolition of grants a generation ago and the failure of loans to keep pace with inflation is causing real hardship for many. A new report has found 1 in 4 universities have now established food banks. And I'm joined now by the author of that report, Policy Manager at the Higher Education Policy Institute, Josh Freeman. Good to talk to you, Josh. So, we were all just talking about this before, and those of us who were students were all saying, we were all poor in those days. We all had really small budgets. None of us ever ate out. What is different for students now?
So I think there's a couple of big shifts that have happened in the last sort of 10 to 20 years. Students have been in hardship like everybody else. They've been affected by the cost of living crisis like everybody else. We've all seen inflation, we've all been affected by rising bills, and students aren't excluded from that. But there's a couple of constraints that make life particularly difficult for students. So students are an especially vulnerable group. They depend on money from other people and they depend on money from the government for their support. So it's more difficult for them to work extra hours, which we might come on to in a moment. But also it's about the level of support that they receive from the government. And this is, in real terms, being quite a bit lower than it has been historically. So at the moment in England, it's now at the lowest level in real terms in 7 years. And that means less money in students' pockets, and it's making life for students pretty difficult.
So the point that you were making was that student loans, of course, which have gone up and up from the £400 a year that it was when they first came out. What's the amount that students now can get on a loan? This is the thing. It varies so much depending on the maximum support that you receive, and depending on your parental income and in the nation that you're in. So, for example, in Wales, it's stayed sort of more or less in tune with inflation, and it's more or less kept up. But in the other nations, this is not so much the case. Now, in Northern Ireland and in Scotland, there's sort of an increasing recognition that this is becoming a problem, and they've announced some sort of big sort of catch-up increases in the amount of support. But not the case in England. And England is now becoming a little bit of an outlier, actually, in terms of the support that students receive. So universities are trying to help out. They've always had hardship funds, but are those hardship funds now being used a lot more than they used to?
Yeah, great question, and definitely. And that was one of the big findings of the report. Is that students who would never have historically used hardship funds are now going to them for the first time. And those people who are administering the hardship funds, many of whom I spoke to for the report, are finding themselves under much more pressure, reading stories, harrowing stories of students who are, experiencing these significant financial difficulties. But I want to say something else about hardship funds as well. It's obviously important.
Just explain what they are.
Yes, sorry. Yes.
What a hardship fund is.
So a hardship fund, it's a means for students to apply for money when they're in sort of this real hardship. So the most important thing about them is that they're means assessed. So in order to apply for it, you have to give all of your sort of spending history, a lot of personal details, and very often these are sort of quite bureaucratic, highly bureaucratic even. You have to submit sort of 3 months of bank statements. You have to explain purchases over £100. Now, that's important because it's important for universities to be able to make sure the money goes to the right place. But for those students who apply to them, it can be quite a harrowing experience. And more is, I think, needed from universities to simplify, streamline these so that it's easier for students.
Of all the cities in England, London was one of the ones where fewer students seem to be using these hardship funds. Why is that? I mean, it's one of the most expensive cities in the world to live in.
Yeah, absolutely.
Why are students in London comparatively, it seems, better off than in other English cities?
Yes, so the report showed that London is among the lowest for having a food bank on the university campus. So there's a lot that this doesn't tell us. It doesn't tell us how many of the students are using a food bank, and it doesn't tell us which students are using the food bank. So we're not entirely sure why this has happened. I agree, it's an unusual finding. And Wales, that was actually the highest in terms of the number who had a food bank on campus. We think that it might be because in cities like London and Manchester, who you spoke to for the report, they have a lot of other community groups in the city that might be offering food banks. So a student may not depend on the university, they may be able to go to another local food bank that's near them.
And they may live at home as well, possibly.
Yeah, very possibly, yeah. But interestingly, this data doesn't tell us who's using the food banks. And one interesting finding from the report was that international students appear to be using hardship funds and they appear to be using food banks much more than they would have been historically. And this is particularly interesting because theoretically international students have to have enough money in their bank account before they start university in order to even be able to apply. And yet increasingly we're finding that the money that they had is just simply not enough to meet living standards when they get here.
Well, that's really interesting because, of course, they pay higher fees as well, don't they? So, in theory, they should be well able to afford what they're coming here. I mean, if the universities are putting a lot of more money into these hardship funds than they used to, is that affecting the money that they have to spend on the actual education part of what they should be doing?
Yeah, so we're certainly starting to see the budgets of universities becoming more constrained. And there's a whole load of other factors going on here. So you'll know that the loan that students receive and the annual fee for domestic students in England is £9,250. This is more or less the same as it was when it was put up to £9,000 in 2012. And the fact that this is fixed means that the amount of money universities get per domestic student is more or less the same in nominal terms, but in real terms it's gone down by a third. It's now just over £6,000 in 2012's money. The consequence of that is that students are now losing money per domestic student that they take in, and they're actually being subsidised by the higher fees of international students that you mentioned a moment ago. And this means that universities are very financially constrained, and they're having to make these difficult choices about whether to put money into the curriculum, into teaching, or whether to put money into supporting students. Now, in response to our announcement today, the Department of Education, they said that they've made £276 million available for students for universities to put into their hardship funds. And this sounds impressive, but £261 million of that is money that's set aside for access and participation. It's not primarily intended for hardship funds. What this means is universities are essentially expected to choose between getting students in, from disadvantaged backgrounds, getting them in the first place, or supporting them when they're there. And that's a difficult choice for universities to have to make.
It really is. Josh Freeman, report author, very good to talk to you. Thanks very much.